Hey guys, welcome. Today we're going to talk with Danny from TikTok. You guys may know him. He hosts Atheist Lives just as I do. He's a well-known atheist on there. Um, but we're going to talk about some philosophy, some religion, things like that, and hopefully it'll be a great discussion. So, hey Danny, how are you?
Hey, what's up? Thanks for having me on, Mike.
Yeah, no problem. So we're going to get through some topics now. The first thing I want to ask you is basically more about you. Tell us about your background. Tell us about your studies and things like that.
Okay. So I was raised a young recreationist
Hmm.
Christian. Um, I was really into apologetics, which led to philosophical studies, and then through a lot of philosophical conversations, amongst other factors, I left Christianity in 2020. And I sort of like fully embraced atheism really, really fast. I skipped the agnostic phase pretty fast because I saw some pretty serious objections to theism. My educational background, I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy, I have a master's degree in philosophy, and I currently teach grade school. I teach science and philosophy sometimes, depending on what they need. And then I also teach at a university and community college. So I teach philosophy, religion usually, but I also this year I teach logic and intro to logic and just philosophy 101 kind of thing. So just a bit
Okay,
about my
pretty nice.
background.
Cool. Sounds good. Um, I took a couple of philosophy classes in college, but I really didn't. It wasn't my main focus. I studied science.
Mhm.
Um, Great. So now, when it comes to, I want to talk about today more like theism versus naturalism, kind of like the philosophy of like religion and evidence, the nature of evidence, things like that.
Mhm.
Because these are topics that we ask when we ask about God, right? What's the evidence for God? This is questions we typically ask as atheists.
Mhm.
So, to you, what exactly is evidence? What does evidence mean to you? And what is like the theory of truth that you hold to when it comes to what is true about reality? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So broadly speaking, evidence is something that you would expect on a hypothesis being true or statement being true. So something that basically, if you have a statement or a hypothesis, it makes predictions. That data, those that's predicted, is what I call evidence to support the hypothesis or the statement. So, I mean, you can have a pretty sophisticated theory, or you could have a very simple statement like "There's a horse in my garage." That makes predictions about what I'll see if I go there. So then, if I were to see no kind of organism in my garage, then that's the predictions, the observations weren't met, my expectations weren't met. So there's no evidence for a horse being in my garage. And of course, you get more complicated than that. But broadly, that's how I understand evidence. Theory of truth. That's a difficult question. Um, I I guess there's a theory of truth. I'm flirting with a pragmatic theory of truth, understanding truth as a goal, the kind of goal of inquiry. We ask questions. When we're striving towards something, when we're engaging with certain methodologies, whether that be scientific, mathematical, or whatever. That's but the more I think about it, the more I kind of want to be a pluralist. There's a lot of senses of truth that I think might be viable. Some very popular, the very popular correspondence theory of truth. I mean, like I like to start there in conversations because people kind of grasp that, but it's not. It's kind of like a concept that's hard to break down. I could definitely be wrong about my theory. It's not that a lot of this stuff can be difficult, but I lean toward a pragmatic theory of truth.
Okay, understandable. Yeah, I typically start with correspondence theory as well, and I go from there. And to me, truth is what really describes reality. It's really like statement based. Now, when it comes to God, do you think that there's evidence of God, and could we use? I mean, a lot of theists typically like to use Bayesian principles, where they assess the probabilities of God existing or not, and they look at the real world, they look at like phenomena like moral agency, and they go, well, we would expect that under theism, so that gives credence towards theism. Would you say that we could use Bayesian principles for theism? And would that be evidence for God?
Yeah. So the first issue is that it matters what kind of concept we're using for God. There's a traditional kind of slash classical monotheistic tradition, and you just can't have evidence for incoherent things, right? There's no evidence. There can't be evidence for square triangles. There can't be evidence for unmarried bachelors. It's just the notion of evidence doesn't even apply because it's incoherent to begin with. Okay.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there is no evidence for God because there can't be if you're construing God in this kind of like God of philosophers, perfect being, like traditional monotheistic concept of God. Now you can have watered down versions of God. So some theists just might consider God to be a first cause of everything. Okay, some people might understand God as that which is worthy of worship or that brings the most meaning to one's life. When you have these other kind of conceptions, then there could be evidence for such things. But it matters that we get our concepts right to be able to assess whether there can be evidence in the first place. And if there can be evidence, then I can go ahead and say whether there's evidence. Let's look at if I could quickly. I'm sorry, you cut me off if I'm going too much, but so like if you just define God as this first cause creator mind, okay, so we don't need, let's say this person doesn't want the omni properties, doesn't need all that fancy philosophical mumbo jumbo, just an intelligence out there that brought about the universe and life. Could there be evidence for that? Well, it's hard to know what kind of prediction. So first of all, I think that's coherent. I think
Mm.
it makes there's hard to show a logical problem with what I just described, an intelligence that created life or the solar system.
Right.
It's hard to show a contradiction or a logical problem in that because you're throwing away omnis and other things like timelessness and all that stuff. So now, okay, it's coherent. So now, what should we expect to see if there were such a thing? Just like in the horse in the garage thing, what should we expect to see if we go in the garage? Well, a furry animal of the sort, that goes nay, and like he just has hooves and whatever. But I'm not
Right.
sure what we should expect to see if there was a disembodied mind that created everything. I mean, it doesn't generate any sort of predictions by which we can verify. So even so, there are there's coherent conceptualizations of God that generate no predictions, and I think that's basically a problem that many theists face is that whether it's incoherent or whether it generates no predictions, there's no evidence for God. You're going to have to start adding to this concept in order for it to generate predictions. And I could talk more about that, but the Bayesian stuff, I'm fine. I mean, I'm not a Bayesian epistemologist. I think there are cases where the descriptions and the kind of thought process that Bayesians have are helpful. But in the philosophy of religion, I understand that's very popular. You have Swinburnians that just love Bayes' theorem and stuff like that. So there are aspects of it that I don't mind. I'm really skeptical of this idea of intrinsic probabilities. So what's the intrinsic probability of God creating life, for instance? And then I just
Mm.
feel like people, if when they talk about intrinsic probabilities, it's hard for me to understand probability detached from experience. In other words, like I think that if I have a certain confidence level about how the world is, it's going to be based on how I experience the world or how others experience the world in their testimonies, like in the form of studies or whatever. And so I'm skeptical of intrinsic probabilities or subjective intrinsic probabilities. That's my biggest problem with kind of a lot of these Bayesian people that I talk to. But other than that, I don't have that much of a problem with the kind of epistemology they invoke. I don't think that there's an intrinsic probability or probability of if there was such a creator, that what's the probability of it creating life. I don't think there is such a probability that we could know absent already knowing about the kind of thing in its psychology. You have, and so this goes back to what I cut myself off. You have to assume a lot about this creator's psychology. Okay, so
Mm.
you have to build in a psychology to get predictions. But then when you do that, then it's like, let's say a demon that never fails, that wants 8 planets in our solar system. Well, there's evidence for that suddenly.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So if you build in a kind of entailment into your hypothesis and you don't have independent justification for it, looks really ad hoc. And that's kind of where the God of the gaps stuff kind of comes from. That's where they're coming from, the God of the gaps people. So I think that's broadly the way I see evidence in God and theism.
Right. So you would say that we have no prior knowledge nor really prior experience when it comes in relative to God. So we can't really make a probability assessment. Right. So would you say that?
Yeah, or the notion of if we got a coherent model of the theory in the first place, right? Because usually when I debate, I kind of I like to debate on conceptual grounds. There's a conceptual flaw in God, so I don't even need to think about the probabilities if there's a conceptual flaw. But yeah, so once you really water down the concept of God to a point where not even Christians are going to recognize it, or Muslims or these traditional monotheists, then we could start talking about what predictions. But then it seems like you still have a problem.
Right. Okay. Um, so to summarize, I mean, would you say that when it comes to the Christian God, there is any evidence for the Christian God at all? And would you say as long as arguments for God hold some at least some explanatory power, that they actually are evidence for God, the Christian God in
Yeah,
particular?
so my personal view is the Christian God is logically incoherent, and you can't
Mhm,
have evidence for logically incoherent things. Now, you can have evidence for resurrections, you have evidence
mhm.
for people walking on water, but that doesn't mean that there's a Christian God. So I know it sounds kind of crazy, but today I had a conversation with some Christians, and they wanted to convince me that Jesus resurrected. I'm like, okay, let's just say he resurrected. Does that mean therefore the Trinity is coherent? Does that mean that therefore the hypostatic union is coherent? That Jesus is both man and God?
Right.
Um, and the answer is no. Just because Jesus resurrected doesn't make the Trinity not logically unproblematic. And they themselves admitted to me that if the Trinity is false, Christianity is false. So,
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's a big problem for them as well. But I was gonna say, yeah, I agree with you that a lot of people tend to use these near-death experiences or exorcisms as kind of experience or evidence for God or the Christian God, and that's a
Mhm.
mistake, right? Because now you're just assuming, you're presupposing that these things correlate to your Christian God when they can correlate to all kinds of possible gods.
I think something
Um,
helpful too is I think one should ask the Christian, what could God have set up the world where Jesus naturalistically came back from the dead? And if they say no, that's a strike against omnipotence. If they say yes, well, then it's possible that there's a naturalistic explanation for all the data that you're coming up with. And then
right.
now, why do we need God? Because even if someone came back from the dead for 3 days, I mean, there's nothing in our laws of physics that make that impossible. Okay, you could have an orchestrator that made it to where all the right particles collided to where he just resurrects.
Hmm. Yeah, and this actually, I mean, when it comes to the word supernatural, a lot of theists love to use this word supernatural or beyond nature or outside of space time, right?
Mhm.
Um, would you say that the word supernatural is an incoherent notion because everything that we would observe, everything that actually happens, would be just part of the natural world that we just can't explain? Or is that what you would say?
Yeah, it's very hard to understand what supernatural is in the first
Right.
place. But to be fair, it's hard to understand what this whole dichotomy between natural and supernatural or natural and non-natural is difficult
Mm,
to understand. A lot of philosophers are now skeptical. So, for instance, let's say like people in philosophy of mind, they're fine with just saying mind is brain. Okay, and then
mm,
they're fine with saying that. Now, when they're that, and then ask, well, do you think the mind is a natural thing? They're like, well, look, I don't know about all that, the natural versus non-natural. All I know is that I think that mind and brain, these are terms that refer to the same thing. Um, so there's a kind of skepticism about this dichotomy. But if you were to work, even if you were to work within the dichotomy between natural and supernatural, natural and non-natural, it's sort of hard to because there you have the strict dichotomy is natural and non-natural. But then you
mhm.
have supernatural, and then you're adding an extra kind of class of non-natural things, and then it's very difficult to really understand what they're saying. Um, but yeah, it's kind of it's a big question. I have not really gotten a good answer, and that has implications on what a miracle is because the definition of a miracle is not quite clear. I've never really heard a very good definition of miracle.
Mm,
Um, so that it raises those sort of questions as well.
right. Now, would you say that when it comes to your philosophy of mind, would you say that the mind is material, or would you say that there is an immaterial aspect to it, or
Yeah,
something?
I don't. So I'm kind of weird this way. So let me just start out with my reasoning, and I'll get to answer your question directly. So I think there are certain things that are going to be hard to. Okay, the first issue is what is the difference between natural and not natural, material,
Right.
immaterial. That's already a project in itself, and the more I look at it, the more I start to see that this is suspicious. Okay, like exactly pinpointing what makes something material immaterial is
Mhm.
difficult, and there are various ways of characterizing it. One way I do like that relates to philosophy of mind is I like this dichotomy between things that are in the first person point of view and things that are in the third person point of view. So, so the I could elaborate on that if you need me to, but like the point is that uh let me think of let me give you an example. So this is a pen. You and I perceive it as a pen.
Right.
Okay. Now, if we showed this to an alien race that had completely different psychologies than us and histories, okay, they don't have hands, they don't write, nothing like that. Okay. And you were to show them this, right? And you show it to them, but they have science. Okay, they have their physics.
Mhm.
If you were to show it to them, um, and ask them, what is this? Well, they can analyze all the elements that make this up. They can analyze how long it is. They can describe it all physically. But could they come to the conclusion without appealing to our own psychology, our kind of sociological background? Could they know that this is a pin? Seems like they could analyze all the molecules, all the quarks, everything that builds it up, and not come to the knowledge that it's a pin, unless they analyze our own beliefs and our own ends, our own goals, right? Because we use this for the goal of writing. And that's how we use the term pen to describe the kind of utensil that uses for writing of this. So, the point is that what the alien would have access to is things in the third person point of view, things that every psychology has access to, no matter what their values or background beliefs are.
Right.
Okay. And then there are the kind of things that are not so analyzable that way. Um, so like people want to say qualitative states, so like experiential states are the kind of states that are just impossible to approach without being the person that has them. Okay. And so now it's so like if I'm right, and I could be wrong, this is probably my most controversial philosophical view, especially amongst the atheist community. Um, if if science is in the business of third person point of view stuff, so like the aliens can analyze all the quarks, everything, right? Um, and they can't analyze my first person point of view unless they were just me. Then it seems like we have a dichotomy, we have a kind of dualism there. Okay, that things that are analyzable are things that are only in the third person point of view. You can't reduce the first person point of view to the third person point of view stuff. So that means that things in the first person point of view, like experiential states, beliefs, desires, your point of view is not only very private, but just not easily approached by the sciences I've just characterized it. Now, could I be wrong about all this? Yes, but there's a specific philosopher that kind of inspired me to think this, to kind of like with these considerations. His name is Akil Bugrami. He's at Columbia University. He himself is an atheist, and he's not a naturalist. And this is in it. And so but there are characterizations of natural that, okay, I'd be a naturalist, right? It's just not very clear what most people have in mind when they're saying natural versus not natural.
Right. And I guess in theory, you could, I mean, if the alien did come down, they could understand what a pen would be used for without prior experience. I guess if they actually had all knowledge of like every possible thing.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't know about that. That's a difficult thing to answer. Um, Now, when it comes to now another dichotomy we have typically when these debates and discussions is like naturalism versus theism. I think that typically people love to use naturalism as a theory. I typically don't like to do that anymore. Would you agree that naturalism or even
Yeah,
theism are not theories; they're just mere descriptions?
I kind of agree. I'm not so sure what, because naturalism is, at least, so it depends on how people are using the term, but generally I like to use the term naturalism to be a thesis about the nature of things. So
Mm.
everything that exists is natural. That's some kind of claim about how things are in their essences, or right. You're not trying to explain a certain phenomenon in terms of another phenomenon. So it's not a theory in that way. So I sort of agree. If you're making the claim, hey, the nature of things is such that they're natural. There's nothing non-natural in the world, right? You're not trying to say, hey, well, look, here's a phenomenon that we're wondering about. Well, here's a theory that explains this. I mean, it's just, I think that's two different projects going on. So yeah, when people say naturalism explains things, I think the way I want to interpret them is that, could a natural thing explain this phenomena that we know about, as opposed to are we committed, or could, if a natural thing or state couldn't explain that, then is it a non-natural thing then? Okay, so that's how I interpret them. But yeah, metaphysical naturalism I don't take to be like theoretical in the kind of way where there's like an explanandum, something that needs to be explained, and the explanandum, something that is doing the explaining. I don't really see metaphysical naturalism as participating in that kind of dialectic.
Yeah. So, we would say that under naturalism, it's a mere description of reality. It's that there's just space, time, energy, and matter, and everything that we observe fits within those descriptions, and therefore naturalism is true. Right. That's essentially the conclusion we make as atheists or naturalists. Would you
Mhm.
agree?
Yeah, I think that something like that would be fine.
Okay. And are you a naturalist? Would you consider yourself naturalist
I
or
don't
agnostic?
consider myself a naturalist. No.
Okay.
Mhm.
What do you do? What do you consider yourself?
Well, like I said, the more I think about it, the more I think this dichotomy between natural and non-natural is suspicious.
Hmm.
So, like again, like if you were to think that some belief state is some neurological state, why do we need to add the word natural to that? Like it seems like now again, but there are characterizations of the natural. I think I know of three. That space time, I think it might be one of them, but the first person, third person kind of thing I tried to explain, and then that which can be described in terms of regularity, causal regularity, or explanatory regularity. So things that operate kind of clockwork or in terms of laws, we could call natural. In which case, then yeah, they might just say that beliefs are natural because they can be described by physics in principle.
Hmm.
So yeah, but there are there are issues that I have with all of this. It gets complicated pretty fast, but suffice it to say, it's not clear what natural versus non-natural is supposed to be in the first place. And every kind of way that you make the dichotomy, there seems to be something that is out of the natural category. So it's a project that I'm thinking about.
Okay. And what exactly would you say is outside of the natural category?
Well, so if you, for instance, okay, so here's one. So let's take the understanding that that which is natural is that which has causal regularity, but
Hmm.
there's indeterminacy, perhaps. Is that so? Is that like a supernatural event, or is that a non-natural event,
Mm,
like
yeah.
quantum indeterminacy, that kind of stuff, stochasticity? In fact, now many scientists don't really care for the word causal anymore.
Right.
So like it's that. So that would be. So then we have to revise. Maybe there's a kind of regularity, but it's not causal regularity. So then there's like, so what do we? And then it becomes. So then what do we do with the indeterminacy again? Like it's just like.
Yeah, we
So
would
that's
have to
one.
just we would
What
have
do you
to.
think natural means?
Oh yeah, I agree with you that it's a very ambiguous thing.
Mhm.
I would think that we just have to like redefine what it means to be natural to fit in with what we observe. Um, but anyway, I want to talk about God now and the arguments for God because you said something. I think I heard you say before that you believe that God does not exist. You take an affirmative
I
position
take an
about that.
affirmative position. Yeah.
So what would you say is, or when it comes to the Christian God, I know God is a very ambiguous word, but when it comes to the Christian God or the Muslim God, for example, what arguments work against them?
Yeah. So I have huge issues with one of the things that got me on my kind of atheist path is this property of omnipotence. Okay. So
Hmm.
the property of omnipotence is really hard to pin down. And if you can pin down a definition, it's a definition that like most Christians or Muslims have that they wouldn't know. Like Graham Oppy, right in his book Describing Gods, goes over different philosophical renditions of omnipotence that theist philosophers have put forth, and he either like shows why there's problems with all of them, but then he says at the end of the section that look, there might be a coherent way of understanding omnipotence, but none of these are it. Number one, and if you do find one, it's going to be a sense of omnipotence that would be completely unfamiliar to your average theist. So then, are they just all? What do they not know what they're talking about? So it seems like omnipotence is really hard to cash out. Yeah, you could start with the stone paradox, but there are ways of like trying to gerrymander the definition. But
Right.
then the more you gerrymander, the less recognizable it is in terms of omnipotence. So that was one a bigger problem for me. Not other than that, what I just brought up there is omnipotence seems to imply infallibility, that you just can't fail. That when you want something, you get it because you have the ability to see succeed in everything that you do. If you don't have the ability to succeed in everything that you do, right, then you're just not omnipotent. So it seems like omnipotence, you get infallibility. So then suddenly, what? We hear things like God wants us to be in a relationship. God wants none to perish. God wants me to be a Muslim. God wants me to submit. God wants me to listen to the Prophet Muhammad. But he's
Mm.
not succeeding with respect to any of this. In fact, there's tons of failure in these religions with respect to things being out of conformity with what God wants. That is not compatible with infallibility. And if God is fallible, goodbye omnipotence, because I think they go hand in hand.
Right. But before you go on any further, I want to go back to omnipotence and what exactly for the audience, right? What exactly is wrong with omnipotence, or the typical definition of it? I know there's
So
cases where it's reduced to something that a being can do, but then that can be go ahead, elaborate for us.
yeah, so there are lots of controls of omnipotence. I'll give the two most common. So the first one we'll call task-based omnipotence. Okay, so making a cake. Think of like your gerunds, the ing stuff, right? Okay, lying. Creating a rock that you can't lift. So these are technically not propositional. Like if I just say making a cake, that's not true or false. That's just a
Mm.
task. And so one control of omnipotence is that God can perform all abilities in the sense that he can perform all tasks. Okay. But what about omnibenevolence, right? So a lot of theists want to say God can't lie. God doesn't have the ability to lie. And so now I can lie. God can't lie. So I can do something God can't. And God's supposed to have all abilities. Is he be able to perform all tasks, but he can't perform the task of lying. So then you have a problem. Okay.
All
So
right.
then what the natural shift is to, okay, let's not do task based. Let's do event based, or I think usually I hear it event based, but there's some other names for it that slipped my mind. And rather than determining in terms of tasks, let's talk about making sentences true. Okay. So the sentence God is lying, no one can make that true, apparently. Okay. Now God can't, I can't. So we both can't make that true. So it's not like a strike against God. There's not something that I can do that God can't do. So it seems like we've overcome the issue, at least temporarily. But then the question is, why can't God make the sentence God is lying true? Well, then they start to appeal to the kind of being that God is. God is defined as a being that can't do those things. Okay, well then there's something called the McEar objection, Mr. McEar.
Mm.
And Mr. McEar is a being that's defined as a being that only tugs at his ear.
Mm.
Okay, so this being is omnipotent on that control because that control is making any sentence true, right? No one making any proposition come true, and the proposition that or doing anything logically coherent so long as in accord with one's nature. It's within the only thing that Mr. McGears is just supposed to do, according to his nature, is pulling at his ear. So he can do all logical things, make any logically sentence true,
Right.
and it's so long as accorded with his nature. But he can't, like, it just seems like it's the McGear objection seems to highlight the issue of just trying to understand God's omnipotence of making logically coherent sentences true while taking into account the kind of nature that God has. So I think that you have that kind of issue with omnipotence, or that event-based omnipotence. You have Mr. McGear would be omnipotent.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it gets more complicated. I'm not really prepared to get into the more complicated stuff, but that just seems to be on the face of it issues with omnipotence.
Right. So that's why these objections, they kind of lead you towards the idea that God's infallible with his omnipotence and comes with it. And hence the things we see today go against his nature, and
Mm,
therefore he doesn't exist. Okay.
mm.
Great. Um, and what's another objection to God you think it works really well?
Well, when you say works really well, there are things that that convince me that are probably not very convincing to many people. So it's like
Mm.
I think there are a lot of good arguments, but then there's ones that are more convincing, less convincing. I'm philosophically oriented, so I'm sort of like interested in the kind of conceptual problems. There are people that do great anti or counter apologetics against the Bible. I just don't know a lot about the Bible, so and I think that if you're succeeding in that kind of department, then that could be very convincing. But I think in terms of the most convincing issues with like a God that is loving is something like the evidential problem of evil. Like the idea is that going back to our notion of evidence. So evidence is what you would expect given a hypothesis being true, what you would predict given a hypothesis being true. So we take the hypothesis that there's a loving being that has all power or that doesn't fail or whatever like that.
Mhm.
Okay. Bracketing the issues of the divine properties like omnipotence. So what should we expect the world to look like? And I think what ends up happening is a lot of these theists is that, well, there is no particular way that the world should look like. Human history could look like anything because God could have a morally sufficient reason for allowing literally anything to occur. And so then but the point is that then what does a loving mean in the first place? Or what's good mean in the first place if it doesn't predict anything like it doesn't predict anything in particular?
Mhm.
But if they say that, on the other hand, that it does predict things like we wouldn't expect to see disease, animal suffering, genocides, well, then suddenly now we have evidence against the hypothesis. So they're in a pickle here.
Right.
So if it generates predictions, well, it looks like this is not we see a lot of gratuitous suffering and evil, and we see all the stuff I listed. If it generates no predictions, then what good is the term good God? You could just put evil God, and you would just expect the same kind of world. Like it's just a worthless attribute. And that's kind of one thing that really solidified my view against traditional monotheism.
Okay. So kind of the problem of evil, the evidential problem.
Mm.
Okay. Do you like the admissions free will paradox? You like that?
Yeah. Generally, no. The way that it's presented, so because I think of what are the Greek fates? So is that what they're called? Like in Hercules, the ones that cut the thread.
I don't know.
So in Hercules, there are these three, I think the sisters, fates, or whatever, and they know all, but all they do is decide when you die. They didn't create anything. They don't have that much power other than to this incredible foresight and when to end someone's life. But they have all the omniscience in the world. They know the future. I think that doesn't really strike. I mean, maybe it might be my view of freedom. I think the real problem that undermines freedom is God's providential decrees, if anything. So, and it also depends on how you're construing free will. There's certain versions of free
Mm.
will where there are problems. So, like libertarian free will, I don't see how there could be future facts about what we do if libertarian freedom is true. So, in that sense, God couldn't know future acts. So,
Right.
if God does know what you're going to do in the future, then libertarianism is false. So
Mhm.
I think that might work, or at least a version of that might work. So it's not like I'm completely against it, but I think a lot of atheists kind of screw up that argument. It's going to take a little bit more argumentation, I think, to go from God knows what will happen in the future to therefore that action is necessary. That's very hard to make that logical jump because I know that the sun will burn out. I know that. Does that mean that it might be? But that doesn't mean it's logically necessary that it'll burn out. There's a logically possible world where it continually burns. It might be different laws of physics, right?
Right.
So just because you know something about the future doesn't establish the necessity of that thing. So I think one needs to do a little bit more work than just to say that.
Right. But what if God? I mean, because God's infallibility when it comes to knowledge. I mean, it would be a necessary fact that, for example, the sun will burn out and that must happen. I mean, if it doesn't
Mhm.
happen, I mean, you can invoke, I mean, multiple possible worlds and say that God knows everything that happens in every possible world, but wouldn't that still be in this world that there is a determined outcome and it would defy God's foreknowledge?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of inference is that because necessarily, if God knows X, X will occur. That seems true. In fact, it is true.
Mhm.
But by the way, that's true for anyone. Knowledge is factive, no matter who has it. If you know something, it's true necessarily. So the word infallible before knowledge, okay, maybe that's doing something there. But the point is that if anything knows, it just means it's true. Okay, if it's not, you
Mhm.
can't know something false. Okay, so if I know that now I might think I know, and I could be wrong in the claim that I know. So
Mhm.
that might be what we mean by infallible knowledge fallible knowledge. But if it's true that I know, then necessarily the sun will burn out. Okay.
Right.
But it's hard. So this is actually a special kind of modal scope, kind of a modal fallacy, where if someone says necessarily if X then Y, you can't infer therefore necessarily X. That necessity clause covers the entire conditional. You can't just move it to the consequent. It's called a modal scope fallacy. So yeah, it's true. Necessarily, if God knows X, you will do X, but that doesn't mean therefore necessarily X. At least you're going to have to give more of an argument to show why that necessity operator can justifiably go to the consequent of that conditional. But if anybody's interested, you can look up modal scope fallacy.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask you what's the best argument for God, but I really don't like that question at all.
Yeah.
Unless you want to answer it, like, what do you have one or no?
I think all the arguments are really bad.
Right.
Now they're clever arguments, but they're all bad.
Right.
Like you could, flat earthers can be clever.
Right.
I mean, actually, some of these flat earthers could probably beat me in debate, to be honest. Maybe they won't beat you, but I don't know a lot about,
Yeah.
the science. I rely on NASA and stuff. So when they say I can't trust NASA, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. But I think it's reasonable for me to trust NASA. So, anyways, you can have very clever arguments that get you thinking. Like the ontological argument gets me thinking. Contingency argument gets me thinking. But when you finally kind of see the argument, it's garbage. I don't really think I don't think there are any good arguments against God. Now, are there things that could happen to me that where like my poor little psychological self has like I'm just disposed to believe in God? There probably are, but that's not, that would be me being unreasonable. That would just be being emotional or something like if I was so sad, like that if my family died in a car crash, right? That might cause me to believe in crazy stuff. Or if I saw, a UFO, I might start thinking crazy stuff. I don't know. Like I might have a weird psychology, but that is in no way an argument, right? So there are things that I might see or hear or things I might experience that might, I might be vulnerable and just believe wacky stuff. I think humans are that way. But as far as the philosophical arguments or whatever, they're very bad.
Right. Yeah, I would say the same thing. People when they ask me that question, I typically say, well, when they ask, what's your favorite argument for God? I always say, well, there is no. That's like asking what's your favorite flavor of feces. Like they're all bad.
Oh my gosh. I feel like there's certain arguments I prefer to talk about over others. Like as someone interested in philosophy, I like talking about the contingency argument, but from people that are not interested in philosophy, the contingency argument is boring as shit. Okay. So it just kind of depends on what you're into. A lot of the, I had a lot of biology friends that love talking about irreducible complexity, right? They just like having those discussions. I don't. Okay. So there are interesting issues that are raised in doing this kind of stuff, but that doesn't mean the argument is any good.
Okay, great. So the next thing I want to talk about is compatibilism versus hard determinism. I remember like last year or something, you came onto my live, I remember, and you're interrogating me about compatibilism. I was talking about free will.
Yeah.
But are you still a compatibilist? And I'm a hard determinist.
You're a hard determinist.
So what? Try to can just go for the audience, explain what compatibilism means, and then explain why you hold that position.
Yeah. So historically, there's been this debate between you either get one of these two. You either get universal causality, you get determinism, or something like it, or you get the possibility of free will and the rejection of determinism. That's your choices. And a lot of people framed this debate that way. It was a lot of people did. Basically, compatibilists say that it's a bad deal. Okay, why do I have to choose between these two? Couldn't there be both? And so one kind of compatible, the kind of compatibilist I am is that I don't want to decide between universal causality or free will. I want to choose whether I'm free or not comes down to whether the causes are coercive or whether the causes are non-coercive. Okay. So I'm taking a walk or stroll in the park. Someone pulls out a gun. What I really want to do is go on my damn walk. That's what I really want to do. That I didn't choose to have that preference. That was determined, right? We could say that was determined. Okay. But that was my choice for that day. You can say it was explained by antecedent conditions, no problem. But that's what I really wanted to do. The gun undermines what I really want to do, right? What I really want to do is go on my stroll. Now I have to take out my damn wallet and give it to you, something I actually value and don't want to give. And so the gunman, the burglar, is a coercive cause. It's a cause that undermines my will that has been caused. Okay.
Mhm.
So the truth is that I might agree with hard determinists that under this specific construal of freedom, there is no free will. But my issue is that I think we still have to have a concept of voluntary or involuntary. Okay. After
Mhm.
all, people are, and we're not on TikTok, so I don't know what you're comfortable with me saying, but RAPED, graped, right? There are
Mhm.
people that are graped. That notion depends on a notion of voluntary and involuntary. Because if nothing was voluntary and involuntary, consensual sex and non-consensual sex there's and actually no difference, but there is. That non-consensual sex, like rape, is against one's will. It is involuntary. So I might agree with you about hard determinism under construal of freedom that you have in mind, but we still got to have this other notion of voluntary and involuntary that I think our societal or politics really relies on, right? Like when people are forced to go work, when the capitalist class, puts down workers, I want to say that's coercive as fuck, right? Like that's what I want to say, right? And if I think that makes me, I have to have a certain notion of freedom to do that, I think. And it may not match the notion of freedom that is talked about amongst incompatibilists, but fine, I don't need that sense of freedom then. I don't, it's like, it's not even if it's true, I think this other kind of notion is probably more important.
Yeah, I agree with you that when it comes to hard determinism, it's hard to basically hold to that when it comes to, like, like you said, societal issues, things like that. But the typical definition of compatibilism I know of is like when you're like basically a soft determinist, you think that there are deterministic reasons for things, but you also believe that our desires are not determined. Would you agree to that definition?
So compatibilism is the view that you can have freedom and it doesn't even matter if determinism is true or not. In fact, compatibilists can actually believe in it. So you're right. Soft determinism is saying determinism is true and some people can have free will. But compatibilism is saying, hey, it's possible to have free will, and whether people have free will or not doesn't depend on the question of whether determinism is true or not. So you have compatibilists that accept indeterminism, but they're not soft determinists. So there's technically a distinction between compatibilism and soft determinism. So soft
Okay.
determinists are a type of compatibilist in that they accept determinism, but you have compatibilists that say, hey, there might be randomness out there, but whether there's randomness or everything's caused, it doesn't matter. Some people can be free or not. Could I say one more thing about the incompatibilist freedom, this libertarian kind of freedom? Here's
Yeah.
what really convinced me that it's a useless version of freedom, because they want to say that you can like self-cause or self-determine your will. So let's say I have this kind of weird libertarian freedom that I'm the first cause of my will. Okay, my will is free because it's not predetermined or whatever. Excuse me. And let's say I will to play video games. Okay, but some evil demon shuts out my internet. Okay, I don't succeed. So I'm frustrated. Okay, fine. I'm gonna go watch TV. But now the evil demon cuts out my cable. And every time I do this freely will stuff, I just fail over and over again because this freaking demon is like, I'm cursed. That to me is taking away the most important part of being an agent, which is being able to succeed with respect to what you want to do. And if that's the essence of freedom, right? That's compatible with determinism. So I don't want this free will where I can just will whatever I want, will to go to the moon when I can't, or will to to go to the other side of the galaxy to see Obi-Wan Kenobi. Like that will is useless, right? I want to be able to do what I want to do, whether it's predetermined or not.
Gotcha. Okay. So it kind of, yeah, okay, I understand that. So kind of, you define free will as being able to fulfill or to actualize your desires.
Right.
Okay.
Mhm.
Um, but when it comes to hard determinism, I still hold it hard determinism because it's like physically speaking, I think that everything we choose, all of our desires even, are determined by physical things that we have no control over. I believe that our desires are completely controlled by our brain
Mhm,
states, which are controlled by, chemical phenomenon happening in our brains.
mhm.
I mean, would you agree to that to some degree, or
Yeah, I'm fine with saying that, like, I have certain preferences, base desires that I didn't choose to have, right?
right?
I didn't will to will those things, or I didn't desire to desire those things. But
Okay.
I think for me, whether I'm free or not is then able to succeed with respect to what I've been determined to do.
Yeah. Okay.
Or sorry, determined to desire.
Gotcha. All right. That kind of clears it up.
Mhm.
A couple last things. I want to talk about morality. Um, are you a moral anti-realist? Are you a
Yeah.
subjectivist? Okay,
Yes.
and me as well. Um, do you think that it's a lot of people, a lot of atheists hold to some kind of like objective moral realism when it comes to like nature? They kind of tether these objective morals to nature, but
Mhm.
I kind of have a problem with that because um, I don't think objectivity can be grounded in any natural phenomenon. If we're talking about in regards to things like what oughts are, right? I don't think it's possible to ground oughts in the natural physical world. Do you agree?
Okay. Well, so maybe it might help. This is a big conversation. So again, please interrupt me if I'm going too far because this is a big question. So what is an ought? For me, an ought is something that can evaluate success or failure. Okay, so like let's say there's an ought about you shouldn't steal from Walmart. So if someone is stealing from Walmart, they're failing with respect to that standard. If someone is not stealing from Walmart and they're paying for their junk, right, then they're succeeding with respect to that ought. So oughts are standards of evaluation of success and failure. So it creates success failure relations. Notice that desires do the same thing. I desired for you not to steal from Walmart.
Mhm,
Well, if you're stealing from Walmart, that's out of accord with my desire. If you're not stealing from Walmart, it's in accord. So in other words, desires have built-in oughts into them.
mhm,
Okay, and arguably beliefs too, but it's a little bit different. Um,
mhm,
so the idea is that we make judgments, which I think reduce down to kind of desires or about mental evaluations, and we have our values. These are all like desire, value, judgments. These are all basically synonyms for the same phenomenon, but they have different kind of connotations in society. Um, and I have no clue what an ought is as independent from the judgments and values that we have.
right,
I don't even know what those are supposed to be. Why would I care about them? Right. The thing is that in the end, I'm guided by my judgments. Okay. Um, and when I say I'm wrong with respect to my judgments because I didn't know something or like the point is that I have to make the judgment that my past judgments were incorrect. Okay. And I just don't get this outsourcing. mm, I don't. It makes sense to me that there's values or desires or judgments out there as independent from that scheme.
right, exactly.
Mhm.
So would you say that more realism is like an logical impossibility, or would you say that it's
It
possible?
might even be worse. I just don't know what they're talking about. Like,
Wow.
it's like blah, blah, blah to me. Like, it's
Wow.
like imagine
Okay.
someone said there's pain, but there's no brain, there's no person. What
Gotcha.
is that? Like, what is pain absent a brain or a person or
Right.
a subject? I don't know what that is. My notion of pain is tied to the notion of subject. So same thing. Judgment, desires, oughts are tied to personhood. So when they're person independent oughts, I just don't know what they're even saying to even say that it's illogical. So it's like gibberish.
Right. Okay. Wow.
Mhm,
I would agree with you there. So,
mhm.
all right, great. So, last question I want to ask you. I know you said you were a creationist before, which is hard to fathom.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, I used to be a creationist to some degree as well. I became an atheist about 8 years ago.
Mm,
But a lot of people when they're leaving religion, they feel like you sure you probably have as well. You felt like this sense of like dread or feeling nervous about existence existentially. You feel like there's no purpose.
mhm.
Um, how have you really dealt with that when you left religion, and what gives you purpose today?
Yeah. Okay, so this is a good question. So let me start with why God doesn't mean you have purpose in the first place.
Mm,
What these Christians and Muslims and all these other people care about is not about God. They care about the afterlife. They care
mm,
about the afterlife. I agree that if I got to live very happily after bodily death and I move on to a happy place where it's basically, Danny daycare and it's just like I get everything I want, that'd be awesome. I would love that kind of life. I don't think there's any evidence for Danny daycare, but I I'm totally about it. Um, but that's what I care about. I don't care. I don't see. Look, so I often present these theists with a dilemma. Pick a world where if you died right now, you'd cease to exist, but God exists, or a world where you died right now and you went to a blissful place after you died because of the laws of nature or whatever, but there is no God. What world would you rather be in? And it'd be crazy to say that I'd rather be in to say that I'd rather be in a world where I cease to exist, but God exists, than a world where there is no God. When I cease to exist, I go to a happy place for the rest with my loved ones and fans and family or whatever for eternity. Like it'd just be crazy. So I think if anybody's listening to me that's a theist, I'm being I'm psychologizing here, a little presumptuous. The majority of you people care about the afterlife. You care about heaven. You do not care about God. If God gave you no heaven, no afterlife, if He put everyone in hell, you'd cease to worship Him. You cease to care about Him. So theism does not give you any hope, meaning, or purpose, right? Because you could have theism and a horrible existence. God could design you to suffer, just to suffer on this earth, and that's it. So God doesn't give you purpose. What gives you purpose is your values about the kinds of things in your life. You value living. You value loved ones. That's why heaven is valuable to you in the first place, not God.
mm, yeah.
Okay. So that's how I see it. That what gives you our hope, meaning, and purpose is what we value about this world. And that's going to be true no matter whether atheism is true or theism is true. And you definitely have that you can have that without God, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so I think that's my 2 cents on the issue.
Great. Yeah. And I actually raise the same question to theists. I often ask if God exists and but the consequences of believing in God is that you go to hell
Mm,
for believing in Him. Would you still believe in God? And often they say, well, I don't know. Or, that it's kind of like it's kind of, reflecting the point that people don't care about God. They care about the consequences to the afterlife and things like you mentioned. They care about having eternal happiness and peace, which is
mhm,
often to me something that we shouldn't want. I think a life where there are ups and downs and struggles, I think that's a life worth living. It's a more valuable experience when there's ups and downs because there's lessons, there's learning there.
mhm,
I think that's a more fulfilling life than one where you're just constantly happy, right? Like constantly eating your favorite ice cream every day. It's gonna get
mhm.
boring after a while.
Yeah.
Um, Great. So what kind of so last question here, what kind of motivates you to keep having these philosophical discussions? Like what's your goal? Why do you keep going and keep discussing this with people?
Yeah. People ask me this question a lot. No, number one thing is that I would not do this if it weren't fun.
Hmm.
I have like 2 or 3 jobs, depending on the semester, and I do this with my free time. If this was not entertaining, fun, interesting, I wouldn't do it. Okay. Now that's having that motivation is compatible with the motivation of wanting to figure things out or wanting to at least clear your mind of contradictions and incoherencies, right? Like that, these are compatible, right? I think part of this, I think for me, has to be enjoyable. But I am genuinely interested, and sometimes it's painful in trying to like figure out these concepts and clear my mind. It's philosophy is actually extremely difficult.
Hmm.
Um, and I think philosophy of religion is not that hard, but when you look at other
Mhm.
philosophical issues, like we talked about philosophy of mind today, naturalism, there's other metaphysical stuff. It's actually really difficult. Like I think about it
Yeah.
every day, literally every day, and I feel like I'm wrong every day. Um, the philosophy of religion stuff is a great way to start asking questions like about the mind and about morality and stuff because but it's a good gateway drug to these things. So I am generally interested in the broader issues. I think they're very difficult. Philosophy of religion kind of makes me feel smarter. But when you start looking at because most philosophers kind of look at philosophy of religion like a meme,
Mm.
then now, because, if we're right, we have departments dedicated to this, basically Dungeons and Dragons.
Mm.
Like that's, if we're right, Mike, that's what's happened in our society, is that there are $1 million funded departments asking questions about, the nature of a being that doesn't even exist. Okay.
Yeah.
And but that's not to say it's a worthless enterprise, because it raises questions and it got me interested in other issues that I take to be actually problematic. So
Yeah, it's great. I would say the same reasons. It's fun for me to debate. I'm also after helping other people think freely, more critically.
mhm,
I think that as an atheist, as somebody who asks these questions, the questions that often theists don't want to question, right? They don't want to ask, or they shun away these questions. I think that kind of hinders their critical thinking process. I think that when you have instead of having your mind being flooded with all these expectations and hopes for the world, I think that when you let go of these things as an atheist, you let go of all these afterlife notions and all these things, your mind becomes more free, able to think, and leads to typically a better world for people in terms of prosperity. And that's what I'm after. I'm after a better world. That's why I debate. I'm more of an activist than a
mhm.
debater. Philosophy to me is an interesting thing, but it's not my forte. But I debate so that I bring out these and expose these ideas to people and make them think, and hence perhaps may lead to a better world. So yeah, thanks for being here. I
Yeah,
appreciate you a
absolutely.
lot.
Thanks for having me on. I do want to say one more thing about what you
Yeah.
just said. I can say that when I was a Christian, like, it was sort of stressful. Like, I had all these intellectual liabilities. Like, I had, like, when someone brought up a Bible verse, I was always anxious, because I'm like, okay, what nonsense do I have to defend right now? Like,
Mm,
now I can just freely say, okay, well, you're right, that doesn't make sense, and just move on with my life. Whereas, like, if you're tethered to a dogma, it's pretty intellectually stressful. Like, you have to, like, think of ways to maneuver around the objection. Whereas,
mm.
like, yeah, I do feel way more freer in my intellectual thought. Oh, I can accept moral anti-realism without being ostracized by, my church. Like, like that kind of thing. But yeah, thanks for having me on. I really appreciated the discussion.
Yeah, no problem, man. I really appreciate your time, and I know you're busy and stuff, but so thanks for being here. All right, guys, that's it. Go ahead, follow, subscribe if you like this content. Also, follow Danny. We'll have his link in bio, and his name is Danny PhilTalk on YouTube, correct? And
That's right.
and
Yeah.
and TikTok as well. Go check him out, guys. See you next time. Thank you.